For a look at the growing humanitarian crisis in Syria. I'm joined by Daryl Grisgraber. She's a senior advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International, an independent humanitarian organization here in Washington. Daryl, thanks for being on the program. So let's talk about the current status of the Syrian refugees. We know there are more than 2 million taking refuge outside the country. Millions, the number I have, 6.5 internally displaced inside of Syria. What is life like for these individuals?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult, as you might imagine. So we have been visiting the countries surrounding Syria and including Egypt for a couple of years now, talking to the refugees. They have a hard time finding shelter, getting food and clean water, having health care. But we haven't been inside Syria recently because of the security situation. But the news that we hear from refugees who have family members still in the country is that conditions are much more dire inside. Every refugee we speak to normally says, thank goodness we're out, at least no matter how bad our life is. Inside Syria, people lack clean water. They have no electricity a lot of the time, sometimes no communications. There's no proper shelter. And of course, they spend 24 hours a day at risk of being caught in the conflict.
What about the airstrikes? Are you getting a sense they've had an impact on these refugees who are trying to get out of Syria?
Yeah, airstrikes tend to have humanitarian consequences, no matter how, quote unquote, surgical they might be, yes? And so a lot of the impact is that people will have to be displaced again and keep moving. You've probably heard about what was happening from Syria, people going into Turkey recently in Ain al-Arab. You know, airstrikes unfortunately can continue to force that sort of migration upon people.
So what is the biggest need for these refugees? Is it clean water? Is it shelter? Is it food? Some kind of asylum status?
It varies a bit from country to country, but overall across the region, the main thing is that people need to be able to escape Syria and cross into other countries. Most of these countries have been opening and closing their borders periodically at one point or another, so that's the most basic thing they need, is to leave the confines of Syria. Beyond that, shelter is a very big issue in most of the countries that we visited, and especially now that winter is coming. Food seems to be reasonably well taken care of, but water is definitely becoming an issue in places like Jordan, where there's a lot of strain on the system. And refugees are also very upset they're not getting decent healthcare services, and the kids can't go to school a lot of the time.
Well, as you mentioned, a lot of these refugees are also pouring into Turkey. What kind of strain is this putting on Turkey's infrastructure?
Yeah, tremendous, because we've heard a lot about the camps that are in Turkey for Syrian refugees, but in fact, the huge majority of those refugees are not in the camps. They're living in host communities and spread across cities in Turkey, particularly along that southeast border. And it has an effect on roads, on the hospital system, on the national education system, on the water, for example, the ability to find employment. So everything that the refugees are experiencing necessarily is happening to the host community as well.
And how much trauma do you think this is creating for the children of the refugees?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's something that's very hard to measure, but definitely everyone we speak to says that their children are traumatized. They tell us stories of the symptoms that the children are showing, and psychosocial help is very hard to get sometimes for refugees, and it's going to be one of the very biggest future needs the longer this conflict goes on.
Wow, Daryl Grisgraber, thank you so much for your take on this.
Thank you.
Turning